In December last year, in the teeth of opposition, the Scottish Government passed a law permitting everyone to self-identify their legal sex with only the slimmest of gatekeeping. Shortly after that, Westminster invoked the Scotland Act to block it. Uproar. The fight is ongoing. In this moment, 3 issues converged, and Conservatives, the right, the mainstream right, are hopelessly muddled on all of them. 1. What we do with our bodies a matter for state power? 2. At what scale should the politics of the body be governed, if at all? And 3. If we govern the politics of the body, in what contexts and on what terrain should that be exerted? Is that use of state power to be humanistic or posthuman? Many liberal conservatives, which is to say most mainstream conservatives, think point 1 is obvious. What we do with our bodies is a matter for individual conscience. This is conservative in an ironic sense because it's quite a modern idea, and avant-garde progressives don't believe it at all. Not since avant-garde progressivism got fully on board with pandemic measures and everyone started arguing about transgender rights. Since COVID in particular, it's clear that both sides agree the state absolutely does have a say in what you do with your body. Meanwhile, the Scottish gender bill debacle has woken even some liberal conservatives up to the issue of scale. Supposed matters of individual conscience can have far-reaching impacts. As such, these are not, as many had previously assumed, self-evidently trivial or individual enough to leave to individuals or to devolve. I'll argue in this talk that unless we take the politics of the body seriously and govern it at the national scale, the answer to point 3 is a foregone conclusion. Failing to grapple with the proper scale for a proactive politics of the body will deliver a united kingdom that is either disunited or, more likely, increasingly posthuman. Benjamin Bratton, who is a leading progressive theorist of the new post-liberal politics of the body, mocks those who cling to individual bodily sovereignty, which in his view is reactionary, laughable, and obsolete. I agree with him in one sense. Those on the left or right who still imagine we can swerve the politics of the body by leaving it up to the individual really haven't been paying attention. And among those who have been paying attention, though, there is sharp disagreement on where the state has skin in the game as regards what you do with your body. But it's misleading to view these two sides as right and left, for all that they're broadly coded as such. It's more accurate to view them as humanist and transhumanist. In Feminism Against Progress, which out now, get it wherever you find books, although don't expect to find a copy in Waterstones in Crouch End. In Feminism Against Progress, I date the inception of the transhumanist paradigm from the mid-20th century, and with one technological turn in particular. And that is the first mass adoption technology which propelled us into the transhumanist age, the contraceptive pill. The pill was the first transhumanist technology. At this biopolitical hinge moment, both left and liberal right assented, in principle, to the core transhumanist idea, that it's legitimate to use medical technology not to fix something that's wrong or broken, such as an infection, but instead to use it expressively, to improve at will on organismic functions that are working properly, in this case, normal fertility, in the name of personal freedom. In the wake of this, a political contest has been ongoing for half a century now between two competing understandings of what men and women are. These have profound implications for medicine, for policy, and, crucially, for commerce. Under the humanist order, human nature was the standard. We accept in principle that there is such a thing as human nature. This vision of personhood originates within a broadly Christian cultural and political order, and its conception of imago Dei, which is to say the idea that humans are created in God's image. The aim of humanist medicine was to restore deviations from normal and then to stop when we've achieved that. Technology promises that we no longer need to be bound by this. When we embraced the pill, we embarked on the path to mastering imago Dei. And to the extent that we embrace this transhumanist template, we leave behind the humanist one. Under the transhumanist order, then, human nature is the baseline. There is no theoretical upper limit to how far we can and should go in upgrading ourselves. The end point is unknown, but almost certainly posthuman. Half a century on from that hinge moment, every scissor issue that I can think of, where it is simply not possible to be neutral, turns on these disputes over what humans are. Does normal exist? What is sex for? What is a woman? What is a mother? Are we entitled to opt out of normal developmental processes? Should we be free to modify ourselves as we see fit? And if not, why not? What, if any, are the limits to any of this? In underestimating the importance of that moment, the right acceded to nearly every one of the cyborg left's premises, except how fast to drive. Take, for example, the trench warfare currently ongoing over whether or not schools should tell parents about a child's desire to present as the opposite sex. Miriam Cates, who spoke magnificently just now, launched a report recently that showed just how far UK schools are already usurping parents' prerogative on this and numerous other fronts concerning sex and relationships. This seems to have come out of nowhere. It has not come out of nowhere, though. Its precursor is the 1986 court case where Victoria Gillick challenged the right of West Norfolk and Wisbech AHA and the Department of Health to give birth control advice to girls under the age of 16. This case established Gillick competence, a measure that assesses the capacity of children to assent to medical treatment. Gillick is treated as settled case law now. Indeed, our Conservative Prime Minister just boasted about making the contraceptive pill even easier to obtain, with even less medical gatekeeping. But the culture war over school children being transitioned without their parents' consent is just what happens when you map the idea of Gillick competence onto a belief that normal is not the desired medical endpoint, but a baseline we can and should surpass when desired. The movement formerly known as the left is leaning hard into the resulting posthumanism. At its radical edge, it is a vanguard movement for a radical libertarianism of the body, underwritten by a ballooning biotech industry demanding the right of every individual to pursue total biomedical self-mastery. Against this, treating biopolitics as a matter of individual conscience means, in practice, giving this movement carte blanche. Gender-critical feminists, for example, get this. Just because most people don't identify as transgender doesn't prevent gender self-ID allowing males into single-sex changing rooms. Like pandemic policy, the politics of gender are inescapably social. As such, the battlefield is institutions: political, regulatory, legal, educational, and also those commercial ones with an interest in profiting from the abolition of Imago Dei. For the cyborg left is already shaping policy, regulations, institutions, and moral norms, nationally and internationally, in line with this posthuman vision. And it's doing so largely upstream of electoral politics, for example, via NGOs, academia, and regulations. This is not just about trans rights. That is just the tip of the iceberg. If we're all an assemblage of systems that can be started, remodeled, and ended at will, reframing sexed development as a menu of expressive options stands for a wider campaign for individual control over all normative developmental pathways. This abolition of Imago Dei extends into the so-called right to maximize individual freedoms, for some at least, at the beginning of life. Big fertility is already a global industry. Big biotech, spearheaded by transgender rights, is a rapidly growing one. And at the end, too, big death. This now accounts for 3.3% of all Canadian deaths. It could be such a growth market here, too, if the persistent campaigners for assisted suicide get their way. Those still mumbling about individual choice ignore the stark class and power asymmetries that emerge under the transhumanist paradigm. Think of how the utopian aspirations of COVID policy measured up to those policies' brutally asymmetrical impacts in compounding health, education, and employment disparities. Now extrapolate that to every domain where biotech offers supposed new bodily freedoms. Think of the asymmetry, for example, between those buying gametes or gestational services and those selling them, between the freedom of an individual to commission a baby to order, like a designer handbag, and the freedom of the resulting child to know his or her genetic heritage, or between a Polly Toynbee campaigning for assisted suicide for rich boomers, and an impoverished woman in Canada opting to die because the state has refused her appropriate welfare. The mainstream right is asleep at the wheel on these matters. The Scottish self-ID proposal got all the way through Holyrood before Westminster realised just how wide-ranging and disastrous its knock-on effects would be for administration, data collection, service provision, and much else besides, to say nothing of women, and invoke the Scotland Act. We can extend the same potential for intra-union chaos to every biopolitical scissor issue, and there are many. To take just one of many examples, consider First Minister Hamza Yousaf's proposal to decriminalise abortion to term. Polls show only around 10% of Britons support this, but the UK is small enough that what's legal in Scotland on abortion would effectively be legal in England too. Would we see intra-union criminal proceedings as a result? Wherever you stand on abortion, it is difficult to see how any such scenario could avoid further undermining the union, as is already happening in the case of gender self-ID. And in any case, devolved administrations should not be able to steer national policy, especially on issues that are this contentious and cut this close to the heart of what a person is. The tail cannot wag the dog. Add to this that the tail is also often encouraged in its wagging by extra national interests. The supposedly rules-based international order increasingly embraces the Brattonist vision of a globalised, borderless, digitally enabled post-individualist biopolitics. The Leviathan that will supposedly give us all maximum individuation and maximum nurture. For example, the UN's supposedly independent expert on sexual orientation and gender identity was recently exposed as an uncritical proponent of transhumanist gender affirmation by the Lesbian and Gay Alliance. Such individuals and institutions work now internationally to propagate the posthuman vision over the older humanist one. This means using institutional power to flatten the restraining influence of local cultures on libertarianism of the body, and ensuring democratic biopolitical demands only ratchet one way. Hungary's recent legislation on questions of sexuality, for example, is not permitted to set the direction for the EU. Meanwhile, that nation is under considerable pressure to accept wider EU biopolitical norms. I'm bearish on the long-term prognosis for nation-states, which is perhaps heresy for a National Conservatism Conference. But for all that the picture is not rosy, one field in which we can, indeed we must, defend this political scale is as an intermediary between the unprotected lone self and Leviathan on the politics of the body. To the extent that nations still can act according to their democratically determined conscience, they are trying to do so. We're seeing new biopolitical divergence according to local culture and conditions, as in Hungary, already mentioned, or moves by Giorgia Meloni recently in Italy to ban surrogacy outright. But this means actually using power at the national level to mount that defence. In this light, those who set policy in Westminster would be wise to treat Scottish gender self-ID as a warning to ensuring these matters are being governed at the appropriate scale. There will be more. It should already be obvious that letting a devolved administration set British policy on abortion, surrogacy, gender, the sex industry, or any one of those other issues means, in practice, letting the international NGOcracy do so. If this sounds fine to you, I suggest you spend a bit of time reading recent UN special reports on these matters. If that doesn't sound fine, then the politics of the body has to be taken seriously and governed proactively at national level. When, as is more or less inevitable, you get called names for suggesting it's appropriate to use state power in pursuit of a humanist rather than a transhumanist politics of the body, remember, the other side is perfectly happy to mobilise coercive force and just wants to use a dead form of liberalism as a stick to beat you with. And when that dead liberalism is used to argue that Westminster should hand off the politics of the body to devolved administrations, consider that this, in effect, means handing it off to biotech lobbyists, activist NGOs of uncertain funding, and international bodies that are many things, but are certainly not elected or responsive to the cultural conditions of the British Isles. If we treat these as questions to fudge, to devolve, or to leave to individual conscience, we've already conceded. The winners will be those multinational industries hovering to profit from still further industrialising the human person. The losers will be ordinary men and women without the power to defend themselves, without your power to defend them. Our union can and must wield national legislative power to defend against this prospect, utopian in theory, but nightmarish in practice, of a universal posthumanism. If it stands for anything, it must be for those bounded, culturally specific, and embodied ways in which we live with one another here and now. Thank you.